Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining, both live and online. For those who haven't seen, I've posted the link to the handout in the chat, and I'll put it on the YouTube link also. Before I start, I just want to give credit where credit is due, which is I was mid-preparing this shir, and there was a particular reference I wanted that I didn't have on my Oat HaChochma, and I was Googling trying to see if it was online, and I came across a very similar shir to the one I was preparing from someone called Rotseach Shimon, and I've shamelessly plagiarized quite a few sources from him, and I've put credit at the bottom on the bottom of each page of the source sheet, so that I don't get accused of plagiarism. But I just want to give credit to a very beautiful share that I found online from someone called, I don't know who this Rotseach Shimon is, but whoever he is, thank you very much to him for making my job a little bit easier in finding sources on this matter. So I wanted to look at, I don't think, remarkably, I was looking through my notes, I don't think we've ever covered this in depth in my Parsha share. I'm not sure why not. Maybe because we're sometimes on summer holiday mode already by Massei, I'm not sure. But I don't think we've ever looked at in depth the topic of the Rotseach BeShogeg, the murderer by mistake, the manslaughterer, who has this interesting punishment of running away, having to flee to one of the cities of refuge, and is vulnerable if he leaves the city of refuge to the Goel HaDam, the blood avenger, and finally has to stay there till the death of the Cohen Gadol, the high priest, after which he is released, or she is released, the accidental murderer is released and sent, allowed to go back home. And almost every detail of this halacha is difficult and strange and needs understanding. But again, just to familiarize ourselves with the background to this, in fact, I think I printed a summary of the halachas on at the bottom of page 2 from the Rambam in Mishnah Torah. We'll summarize that from the Rambam Mishnah Torah, and then we'll look at the Psukim. But basically, in halachic terminology, there are 3 possible options. There is a murderer b'mezid, a deliberate murderer who plots to murder someone, or in a moment of impulse or rage, deliberately decides to murder someone. And in principle, assuming appropriate witnesses and warning and so on, they are chayav misa, they're capital punishment. On the opposite extreme is someone who causes the death of another. In English, we would call that by accident, but in Hebrew, there are 2 levels of accident. There's an accident which is ones. Ones is an accident where there's no culpability whatsoever. It wasn't no degree of carelessness involved at all. It was something completely beyond any normal level of due diligence, beyond any ethics of responsibility, and tragically, through someone's action, the life of someone else was ended, but in no way can they really be linked to the consequence. And in halacha, that has no punishment whatsoever. There's no punishment whatsoever. And then there's the middle position of someone who indeed murders by accident. This was not a deliberate act of murder, but nonetheless, there was a degree of culpability. They should have been more careful. And the Torah expects high standards of care. One can't go through life casually doing things and not take responsibility for the consequences of one's actions. And in such a case, this is considered Rotseach BeShogeg, an accidental murderer, but a higher degree of responsibility. In Hebrew, as I said, there's 2 types of accident. The more responsible accidental murder, and the less responsible accidental murder. And the Rotseach BeShogeg, the one who murdered by accident, yes, that has a degree of culpability and responsibility, is vulnerable. If they are outside the Miklat, outside the city of refuge, the Goel HaDam, the relative of the victim, has the right to avenge their blood, and can do so, can take the life of the murderer, and therefore they have to shelter in the city of refuge, and there they have to stay. And this is a terrible imposition on the accidental murderer. They leave their home, their family, their business, their neighborhood, their neighbors, their friends, and they're stuck, imprisoned in a city, in a town, and there they stay. And how long do they stay? Until the death of the Cohen Gadol, and at that point they go free. Now, how would this work in practical terms? So we'll have a quick look at the bottom of page 2. And again, for those who have joined, I've posted the source sheets in the link in the chat, and I'll put it in the YouTube link. The Rambam at the bottom of page 2, from the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, the laws of a murderer, the laws of murder. He says, initially, both a deliberate and accidental murderer would run to the Miklat, and then, based in Shaharagba, the court of wherever the murder took place would send messengers. They would bring them, and there they would judge Shanema, so they would judge them. If it was deliberate murder, they would be put to death. And if someone was exempt, they would be declared exempt. And Mishan is chayiv golus machzir, someone who was deemed to be chayiv golus, to deserve exile, would be sent into the Miklat. So here the Rambam says that everyone would go to the Miklat as a defense against the avenger taking their life. Those who are found guilty of deliberate murder would be put to death by the court. Those who are wholly innocent would be declared innocent. And those who are in this middle territory of careless responsibility would go to the Miklat. That's the background to this halacha. Now, there's much to question in this halacha. The concept of Goel HaDam is a difficult one. Vigilante action, the idea that blood can be avenged by a relative, isn't a simple idea. Reuven murders Shimon, it's a tragedy, and somehow Reuven's family have the right, perhaps the obligation, a machlokas, to take the life of the murderer. And why the Miklat? What is the nature of the Miklat, this city of refuge? And why the death of the Cohen Gadol? Why should the imprisonment of the accidental murderer be linked to the lifespan of the Cohen Gadol? So all of these are difficult questions. And really, all I'd like to do today is just go through the Psukim and some of the classic Mefarshim and see a range of responses to this. So let's turn back to page 1 and just learn some Psukim together. This is the Parsha in our Sedra. Hashem speaks to Moshe. So the context, of course, just to contextualize this, is we are nearing the end of Moshe's reign. In fact, next week's Sedra, Moshe is going to give his swan song. It'll be the Sefer Devarim, and Moshe is going to start saying his departing words. Moshe has already appointed his successor. That was last week's Sedra, and they're on the cusp of entering Eretz Yisrael. And almost the last mitzvah that Moshe gives to the Jewish people is Hashem appears to Moshe and says, make sure that your successors, as soon as they enter the lands of Israel, set up Ori Miklat, cities of refuge. So this is almost the final mitzvah that's given nationally to the Jewish people through Moshe. Let's have a quick scan through the Psukim. Pasuk 9, speak to the children of Israel. When you pass over the Yarden and go to Canaan, Pasuk 11, set up cities of refuge. Pasuk 12, these should be cities of refuge from the avenger, from the Goel HaDam. Pasuk 13, 14, which I missed out, give the geographical location of some of these cities. Pasuk 15, setting aside so that someone who murders BeShogeg can shelter there. Pasuk 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 tell us basically that there's a distinction between a deliberate murderer and an accidental murderer. Pasuk 24 that they go to Beis Din, and Pasuk 25 that the Beis Din make a decision whether the manslaughter, the accidental murder, can take refuge in the city or not. And then the Psukim go on, Pasuk 27, that if the avenger, the Goel HaDam, finds the accidental murderer out of the city, then he can kill him. And Pasuk 28, he should stay in the city until the death of the Cohen Gadol. Pasuk 29, interestingly, describes all these halachas as chukas mishpat, as a chok of mishpat, of justice. Now, mishpat is a system of justice which we expect to be comprehensible. Mishpatim are the classic example of mitzvahs that we comprehend, that we understand. Don't murder, don't steal. If you damage someone, you have to pay tort law. That's the whole section of Parshas Mishpatim that deals with laws that we understand. Chukim are the mitzvahs that we don't really understand. You know, my clothing is sharpness or isn't sharpness. Who really understands that? That's a chok. The language of chukas mishpat is interesting terminology, and it seems to be the Torah acknowledging that whilst this is a system of mishpat, there's a justice to this. After all, someone has murdered by accident, but they should take consequences for their deeds. Nonetheless, there's an element of this which is a chayk. There's an element of this which is not as comprehensible as a general justice system. It is still somewhat of an innovation, a Torah innovation, innovative on some level or other. Pasuk 31, 32, and so on say that one should not take a bribe or a ransom. So even though the family have the right to avenge the death of their relative, they shouldn't take blood money for that, neither to save the life of a deliberate murderer, nor to exempt an accidental murderer from City of Refuge. And Pasuk 35 says, don't pollute Eretz Yisrael, with blood. Okay, so that's the sequence of psukim. Now, maybe we'll just jump actually to pasuk to source 2 on page 2, where I cite Reb Shimshon Falhash, and he points out that it's very interesting that this is a mitzvah incumbent on the people as soon as they enter Eretz Yisrael. And he says this is indicating to us the importance of that not one innocent drop of blood that should be shed. So don't enter Eretz Yisrael and set up a civilization which is flippant about human life. You know, when you build societies and cultures and civilizations, you can sometimes come to neglect the common man, or begin negating the importance of life because there's this national project of building a country. In fact, it's a big challenge, right? We've seen this in countries that achieved independence, in our own beloved lands of Israel, when the country was set up. How do you actually balance national interest and individual and personal interest? So this is the message of the Torah. You're entering the land of Israel. You're entering Eretz Yisrael. Be careful. Don't allow yourself to slip into disregard for life, even accidental life. The value of life is such that national interest can't damage individual interest. Make sure that when you're building Eretz Yisrael, it's built with an awareness of the importance of life. Hence, this being such an early mitzvah that's given. What are we meant to make of the concept of Goel HaDam? So even though I translated it as avenger, the truth is that's not the meaning of the word Goel HaDam. Goel HaDam is the redeemer of blood. And we find a concept of a goel, a redeemer, a close relative bearing responsibility to look out for and redeem their relative's needs. So Geula, we often talk about as we talk about Geula, you see us sometimes Geula, the exodus from Egypt. There's many words used for freedom or for redemption. Geula is a type of stepping in on behalf of a relative to somehow redeem or restore for them that which they are close to losing. Where do we find the word Geula used? We find it all over the Torah. Perhaps the most familiar example is the one I printed last, which is in Rus, where Rus arrives with Naomi as vulnerable, isolated individuals. They've lost their spouses, Machlon and Chilion and Elimelech. They've lost their land. And Naomi sends Rus to Boaz to say, you should be our Goel, you should be our redeemer. What's your obligation as a redeemer? To restore our property, redeem our land, and to restore the family line by marrying Rus. In the famous story at the end of Rus, this is printed at the top of page 2, Boaz turns to the Goel HaDam, the closest relative, Ploni Almoni, and says, will you redeem Rus? And he says, absolutely, I'm willing to step in and redeem the land of my relative Elimelech who died. And then Boaz says to him, will you marry Rus? And he says, no, that's too far. And therefore Boaz steps in and does that. So a quick look at the psukim. V'ani Amati, I said, I will disclose a matter to you, saying, if you're willing to be a goel, then redeem. So there's a demand, an expectation on a relative. Your relative is in need. Redeem their land, restore that which they have. So this is an expectation of goal. The source of this idea, and again I printed this at the top of page 2 from Vayikra, and in Bar Mitzvah there's a similar idea. If someone, for example, becomes impoverished, this is source in Vayikra, let's read the psukim. Your brother becomes impoverished, or and they have to sell part of their holding, or A relative, the nearest relative, should be a redeemer and should come and redeem that which the relative has sold. In Bamidbar, at the beginning of Parsha's Massei, we see the opposite. Someone dies and they are the victims of theft, and the thief hasn't yet managed to pay back the victim before they die. Then the inheritor, the relative, gets the property restored, and in so doing is also considered a goel. So what's the theme that emerges from this? What really is the idea of a goel? The responsibility of a relative is to elevate, to redeem that of their relative who is vulnerable or a victim. If the family line is being lost, marry them. If the property is sold because they're impoverished, redeem it for them. If something has been stolen from them, receive back the reparations for the theft because you're restoring property back to the family. This is the concept of a goel. So this indicates to us where the concept of Goel HaDam comes from. Someone's been murdered, their life has been treated casually. Their blood calls out for justice. Someone has destroyed their life in a meaningless way. The responsibility of the Goel HaDam is to step forward and sort it out. They can't just leave this person unrestored. In the same way as their land or their lineage being wiped out, their life has been wiped out, and the job of the Goel HaDam is to restore it. Now, there is a machlokus in the Mishnah if this is a mitzvah, an obligation on the Goel HaDam, or a shus, a permission. And this seems to reflect two different approaches to the idea of Goel HaDam. The Shadal, Lutzato, speaks about this idea and actually ties into some of the stuff I've been discussing a while back on our Sunday morning philosophy series. To what degree does the Torah accommodate human frailty? Or to what degree is the Torah setting up an idealistic system? So certainly the mainstream approach would be, if the Torah grants permission to a Goel HaDam, it's saying this is an acceptable way to behave. The murderer treated the life of their victim flippantly. They in truth have lost their right to life. We give them a way out to go into exile, but this certainly isn't the ideal. So that this has happened. If they don't make it to the City of Refuge, they deserve Misal, they deserve the death penalty. Fundamentally, even an accidental murder deserves death. That's one approach. Lutzato Shadal takes a different approach, and he points out, he argues that this is an accommodation to human weakness. And he points out that the whole of the ancient world had similar ideas of Goel HaDam. When we contrast our halachic system of Goel HaDam to the pagan halachic system of Goel HaDam, of Goel HaDam, you see what the Torah is doing. And the Torah is taking a sort of a natural human impulse, and it's channeling it and it's refining it. So in the ancient world, an accidental murderer, a deliberate murderer, someone who was wholly innocent, and it was even an accident of ones, the highest degree, would be vulnerable to the Goel HaDam. Says the Torah, no, there has to be a court case. The Goel HaDam has to work out first, what is this? Which level of culpability is this? In the ancient world, there wasn't the concept often of a city of refuge, of an Miklat. The Torah sets up an Miklat. In the ancient world, there was the idea that the relative could take blood money, could take ransom. The Torah says, don't take kofar, don't take ransom for this person. In the ancient world, there was the idea that even a deliberate murderer could run away to the temple and somehow seek refuge there. And I think I printed the, I hope I printed the psukim over here. Yes, Shmos 21:14 in the middle of page 2. If someone plots to kill another with cunning, then even from my altar you should take him to die. In other words, a person can't seek refuge in a place of religion, a place of worship, and argue that they should be safe because of this. Okay, so to summarize, we have the concept of a Goel HaDam. It's definitely a difficult concept. The concept, the idea of a Goel HaDam is it's seen as geula. It's seen as a way of redeeming or restoring something which was lost, and it's part of a family of responsibilities of relatives towards their relatives. They have to redeem the property, they have to redeem the family lineage, and part of that is not to allow blood to be shed carelessly. It's not good enough just to say it was an accident. Someone's life was taken. I'm just getting a little bit of interferences, so I'm just going to mute everyone. Apologies. It's not good enough just just to say it was an accident. There's responsibility here. Is this a lechatchila, an ideal system, or an accommodation to human weakness? Perhaps it's pshat in a machlokas in the Mishnah, whether this is reshus, permission is given to the Goel HaDam, or mitzvah is an obligation on the Goel HaDam. And certainly it ties into a more general machlokas through the generations about to what degree it is acceptable to say that the Torah is taking societal norms at the time and tweaking and modifying and elevating them, or to what degree, no, that's unacceptable and we can only understand the Torah saying an ideal. We've spoken about this in the context of the Isha Yafas Torah, right, the captive, beautiful woman that Rashi says, Lo Tibra Torah Ela Keneged Yetzirah. Soldiers in battle have limits on their self-control due to the stress of the battle, and therefore maybe the Torah makes accommodation for human weakness. We've discussed this in terms of Rabbi Sachs's idea about slavery. Is the concept of slavery an ideal or an accommodation to human weakness? And Shadal, in his comments on this is part of a family of discussions. He argues that we can see this as an accommodation to weakness. Societies in the ancient world accepted the concept of Goel HaDam in a very perverted and distorted way, in which even a deliberate murderer it would apply to, even a completely accidental murderer it would apply to, running away to a place of worship would even save the life of a real murderer. It was acceptable for families to take blood money, and the Torah takes all that and modifies it and says, you know what, if you're going to do Goel HaDam, we're not going to stop you completely. However, we're going to modify it and tweak it and limit its ramification. This is one way of understanding the sugya of Goel HaDam. What's the concept of the Miklat, this idea of there being a place of refuge to which one could shelter? So there's really two ideas put forward in the Mefarshim, both of which are undoubtedly correct. They're not alternatives, they complement each other. One idea is that this is a punishment. The murderer gets sent to the City of Refuge and is locked in there. It's a type of imprisonment. And the second idea is it's there to help the murderer. It's there to save them and rescue them from the Goel HaDam. If we look in Bereshis, Perek Daled, and I printed this in the middle of page 2, we see the first murderer having a concept of golus, of exile. So somehow built in, it's an amazing thing, built into the root of creation. Any story in Parsha Bereshis that's dealing with very early humanity is telling us something very fundamental about what people are and how people work. And Cain is punished by Hashem, and he's told he has to wander, he has to go into Golus. And Cain says, I'll do that, but then I'm vulnerable. Because of course he's not an accidental murderer, he doesn't have an Miklat, a city of refuge to run away to. Vayomer Cain el Hashem, Cain says to Hashem, Gadol avoni minso, my punishment is too great to bear. Hashem told him he's going to have to wander. Hein geirashti yosayom al pnei adama. You've sent me into exile. I'm going to wander, but Oretz in the land. And anyone who meets me may kill me. So Cain is speaking to Hashem, and he's saying, you've made me vulnerable by sending me into exile. And in a sense, this pasuk is very revealing as to why the accidental murderer is sent into exile. Someone who takes someone else's life has in some respects made themselves outside society. How can they be part of society? Society is based on normal human interaction. This person has excluded themselves from normal society. They've ended someone else's life. You exclude yourself from human society, fine. So you're out of societal norms. Now you're vulnerable to anarchy, to chaos. You want to live in a world in which there isn't respect for life. So your life has been, the respect for your life is removed, and therefore you're vulnerable to the Goel HaDam. So this is a third way, if you like, of understanding the concept of Goel HaDam. And as the Goel HaDam, the problem with the Goel HaDam is it sounds almost primitive. It sounds almost uncivilized. It sounds barbaric. The language of the Gemara, when it talks about the concept of Goel HaDam, is hitir atzmo lemisa. The accidental murderer he made himself vulnerable. He made himself mutter, unbound or permitted to be killed. He ein lo domim. He removed his right to life. So you want to be a barbarian, you want to be a savage. So we'll put you into a world of savagery, and the Goel HaDam can treat you. See what that's like to live in a world in which you don't have civilization, in which you don't have the normal protection of society, and see how that works. So this is the sort of a third idea that emerges from the halacha. The root of our trouble that bothers us in the Goel HaDam is it doesn't seem like a justice. It seems savage, and the answer is yes, it is savage. As Cain said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you made me vulnerable, you've pushed me out of society, you've pushed me out of the world, and now there's nothing that can save me. Yes, sorry.
As the previous idea, it's more obvious to me that impoverished relative what the restoration is. What is it going to done? Is it like blood not cheap, or is it something
Is the blood is not cheap, like a kol demei achicha type of thing. Yeah, that the blood's not cheap. That's the restorative justice that the Goel HaDam is doing. Yeah. Okay, so these are some of the ideas in the concept of Golos. What I want to try and spend the remainder of the shir doing is looking at the idea of the Cohen Gadol and understanding why the death of the Cohen Gadol should be an appropriate time for the freedom of the accidental murderer. So, and all I've done really is printed a range of sources which we're going to try and analyze and understand. So the first source, we now turn to page 3. Why is the death of the Cohen Gadol that which frees the accidental murderer from their imprisonment? So the first explanation we have emerges from a Mishnah and a Gemara in Makkas, Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph. And the Mishnah says, Lefichach, therefore, imoseyan shel koyanim, the mothers of the Kohanim Gedolim, mesapkus lahen michya uksus, used to provide the exiled with sustenance, food, and garments, in order that they won't pray upon their sons that they should die. So an amazing Mishnah. The Mishnah says that since the freedom of the accidental murderer is conditional upon the death of the Cohen Gadol, which is the most bizarre thing. Why should the death of the Cohen Gadol be the allowance of the accidental murderer to leave his prison? But either way, since that's the case, the mothers of Kohanim Gedolim, who were very proud of their sons, who have become the Cohen Gadol, were nervous. The accidental murderers are surely going to be davening for their freedom and davening for the death of the Cohen Gadol, and therefore they would try and mitigate the discomfort of the exile by providing food and clothing for the murderers. So said the Mishnah. Now the Gemara asks in this Mishnah, it says, I don't understand this. How can it be that an innocent person, the Cohen Gadol, could die due to the tefillos of these people? Is there such a concept in theology that I can daven for someone else to die and my tefillos can possibly take effect? The Gemara says this is nonsense. There can't be such a thing. Answers the Gemara that the Cohen Gadol is vulnerable because they should have pleaded for mercy for their generation and they didn't plead. In other words, they are the spiritual leaders of the generation. If an accidental murder took place under their leadership, their spiritual leadership, they are to some degree culpable. They are to some degree responsible. And therefore they are vulnerable to the complaint of the accidental murderer who is davening for their death and saying, I'm somewhat here because of you. You didn't daven, you didn't inspire, you didn't bring enough spirituality in the world such that an accidental murder didn't take place. This is the first version in the Gemara. The Gemara brings an alternate text in which the Mishnah reads that the mothers of the Kohanim Gedolim would give food to the murderers in order that the murderers should daven on behalf of their Kohanim Gedolim, that they shouldn't die. In other words, in the second version, the default setting is that the Kohen Gadol is so responsible that he ought to die in order to free the murderers. And therefore they wanted the tefillah of the murderers to protect their children. So in version number 1, the Kohen Gadol is okay, unless the accidental murderers plead for his death, and they have a claim on him, unless they make a claim on him. In version number 2, their claim on him is so strong that it's there by default that the Cohen Gadol is vulnerable to death, unless on the contrary, they daven for the Cohen Gadol that he shouldn't die. So this is an amazing Gemara, and this is the first explanation, if you like, as to the link between the death of the Cohen Gadol and the freeing of the murderers, that on some level or other, the Cohen Gadol is responsible for this to take place. A society which is flippant about the death of an individual, of casual, careless death, is a society where the spiritual leaders have failed. The Cohen Gadol bears some culpability for that occurring, and that's the link between the death of the Cohen Gadol and the freedom of the accidental murderer. So says the Gemara. So this is our first explanation. A second explanation as to the link between the death of the Cohen Gadol and the freeing of the murderers is an amazing Talmud Yerushalmi. And the Talmud Yerushalmi in Yuma says that Rav Simon b'shem Rabbi Yonason, the Beis Govern, Rav Shimon in the name of Rabbi Yonason, the Beis Govern, said that there are two sins for which there ought not to be atonement. These are such terrible sins that kapara, atonement, wiping clean of the slate, doesn't seem to make sense. The first sin is Lashon Hara, an amazing and scary Yerushalmi. Lashon Hara is so awful, it's such a debasement of human spirituality that there ought not to be a kapara, an atonement for it. Nonetheless, the Torah establishes as kapara for it. We won't go into that for today. The second sin is the final paragraph of the Yerushalmi. So in the middle of page 3, this is Yerushalmi in Yorama 7.3. Hahorig nefesh b'shgaga lo hoyselo kapara. Someone who murders by mistake, through carelessness, should not have had atonement. The kova lo haTorah kapara, and the Torah nonetheless makes for them an atonement. Misas Cohen Gadol, the death of the Cohen Gadol, and then it cites the pasuk. Vayeshev ba'ad Mosa Cohen Gadol. The murderer has to stay in the Miklat till the death of the Cohen Gadol. So in this second explanation, this Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi seems to be saying that the death of the Cohen Gadol somehow atones for the murderer, achieves forgiveness for the murderer. Now, I don't know exactly what this idea means, that the death of one human can somehow atone for another human. We have similar ideas a little bit in Achremos, Bikrovai Akodesh, at the time of the death of the sons of Aaron, when Moshe and Aaron struggled to understand why Nadav and Avihu should have died at the time of joy of inauguration. Hashem responds to them and says, "B'krova HaKadosh," is a concept of "I'm sanctified through those who are near me." And Rashi brings the link between Parshas Achremos and Yom Kippur, that just like Yom Kippur atones, so do the death of Tzaddikim atones. And there's a concept of the death of Tzaddikim, that the death of righteous somehow atones. One way of understanding this is to tie this into the whole of Sefer Vayikra. We know that there's a concept of a korban, of giving something up in order to achieve atonement, sacrifice for atonement. You bring a korban, a sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash, and through giving up, somehow that's a chatos, that's an atonement of sorts. And I take that which is precious and I give it up. One way of understanding this idea is somehow that the Cohen Gadol, who after all is the head of the Kohanim, the Kohanim whose job is to serve in the Beis HaMikdash and bring karbonos, he himself is brought as a carbon in order to achieve kapara for the generation. So normally, the Rambam points this out, that all karbonos, what's the meditative experience that the bringer of the carbon engages in when they bring the carbon? So they do smicha, they lean on the carbon and they say vidoy, they confess their sins. And the Ramban says that the experience of bringing carbon is a powerful experience. You see this animal full of vibrancy and life, brought into the Beis HaMikdash and shechted. Its life is taken, and you see its blood and its fat and its limbs offered as a sacrifice. And you reflect on this, on the vulnerability of human existence, and how it ought to be me who's there suffering this experience. I've sinned, I've let myself down. Really, I've lost to some degree the right to life. So all karbonos are a reflection on human mortality and a sense of a person almost giving themselves up, sacrificing themselves. But we don't sacrifice a human being, we sacrifice an animal. With the death of the Cohen Gadol, almost as if the Cohen Gadol is sacrificed. His life is given up for Klal Yisrael, and that's the atonement, the kapara for this Rotseach. And also, Yerushalmi is saying something very powerful. The sin of Rotseach BeShogeg is so terrible that really there shouldn't be a kapara, there should be the death of the murderer. However, the Cohen Gadol, through his death, cleans the murderer. It's like a national carbon that's brought. This is possibly the explanation of the Yerushalmi, and this is a second pshat. Rashi gives a third pshat in this idea of the link of the Cohen Gadol, and let's just read Rashi over here. Ad Mos HaKohen Gadol, until the Cohen Gadol dies. So Rashi says an amazing thing. The job of a Cohen Gadol is to bring the presence of the divine into the world and to lengthen life. The murderer removed the divine presence from Israel and shortened life. It's not possible for them to live in the presence of the Cohen Gadol. Rashi is saying a most amazing and remarkable idea. Rashi says the explanation of the exile to the Miklat is to cut the Rotseach off from society. Which part of society? From interacting with the Cohen Gadol, from being impacted with by the Cohen Gadol. The Cohen Gadol's job is to bring ruchnius, spirituality, awareness of Hashem to the world, to be mashresh chino, to cause the divine presence to rest on Klal Yisrael. The accidental murderer has lost the right to interact with the Cohen Gadol. He stands for contradicting everything that the Cohen Gadol stands for. So the murderer is removed and locked away so that they can't interact with the Cohen Gadol. An amazing idea. So Rashi sees this as almost a spiritual penalty, that they're cut off from the Cohen Gadol, and they can't draw spirituality from the Cohen Gadol, who they have defied and contradicted through the act of murder in the most terrible way. Now the Cohen Gadol's died. Okay, there's a new leadership, a new Cohen Gadol, the next generation. The Rotseach is allowed out. But the Cohen Gadol, under whom he committed the murder, he can no longer draw spiritual energy from that Cohen Gadol. A most remarkable idea of Rashi. Looking puzzled about this, or
no, just thinking. Thank you.
Okay. So he's removed himself from being able to draw spiritual energy. Therefore, he's cut off. Okay, so what have we said so far? We've said a Talmud Bavli that understands this as some culpability of the Cohen Gadol. That's the Gemara in Makos. The Cohen Gadol is vulnerable because had he done his spiritual leadership properly, he would have avoided such carelessness happening. We've got a Talmud Yerushalmi that says that this is some form of atonement paralleling the death of an individual. And we have Rashi, an amazing idea in Rashi, that this is to cut the accidental murderer off from the spiritual influence of the Cohen Gadol. He's no longer able to draw energy from the spirituality of the Cohen Gadol.
Just ask actually, the first one, the Gemara, which is saying that there's culpability and that the mother therefore is providing the food and the garments in order to try to negate that. That seems to really be stressing that because of the culpability, this Cohen is going to be dying quite prematurely because we're assuming there is a mother around, and
yes,
it goes with that.
Yes.
That a mother around, a mother who's strong enough to do all this. It's not a relative, it's a mother, which is very specific.
Very, very interesting. So yes, it's suggesting the Cohen Gadol is young, and is at risk of dying prematurely due to their failure of spiritual leadership. Yeah.
And there's no other protection. There's no other protection allowed if this mother is not alive. I don't know.
Well, at least no one cares enough about. No one. It's a mother's love to care about this. Yeah. Children, siblings. Yeah.
Right, but it's the specificity of the
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned previously that prayer isn't a lever of control. So how, if they're praying for the Cohen Gadol's death, how would that open Hashem's eyes? Because essentially the Cohen Gadol is fit for his job. So how would that point out anything to Hashem other than the fact that someone in that generation did something wrong?
Okay, very, very nice question. You're putting together my shiurim of tefillah and this. Okay, and thank you for giving me the chance to elaborate on this. When they are praying for the death of the Cohen Gadol, what they are saying is they're crying out against an injustice. They're saying there's a chil Hashem over here. There's a travesty of all that is right and spiritual. How dare the Cohen Gadol carry on living when there's a failure of leadership that has allowed me to get into such a rut? And therefore, it's the same. This was the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question was, how can tefillah cause the death of an innocent Cohen Gadol? This is ridiculous. And the Gemara's answer is no, that's not the case. They have a justice in their claim. And in the same way, someone can daven for Hashem and say, open my eyes, I need to see you running the world. A slave in Egypt can daven to Hashem, come and redeem us. Someone going through a tough time can daven to Hashem and say, save me, not as a lever of control, but as a recognition of human vulnerability. I need you, Hashem. The murderer can turn to Hashem as a recognition of human vulnerability and say, I need you, Hashem. You're allowing my persecutor, the person responsible for my devastating action to live. How can we have a leader like that? So they're crying against the Chil Hashem and disgrace of the Cohen Gadol living.
It's interesting actually in the sort of current debate about the nanny state and how much should the state get involved in making people look after themselves. This indicates that in Judaism there is this idea that the leaders should, make sure people protect their own actions.
So the leadership that the Cohen Gadol is meant to exert is not necessarily a nanny state rules and regulation one, but it's a spiritual one. If the Cohen Gadol does his job and teaches people and brings spirituality into society in the right way, then this person would have been more careful.
And yet it does negate any personal responsibility for that person, saying it's all his fault. Once he's died, I'm actually completely free. There's no further.
Not necessarily any further, but there's a softening or lessening. Yes, there's a degree to which it is a person has to take responsibility. He is somewhat responsible, but it's equally correct to recognise that there's a Klal spirituality responsibility at work here. So both halves are true. And these are amazing ideas. I share them with you. I don't know what to make of them. Very, very difficult ideas. I have to tell you, I'm embarrassed to say this till I was preparing this year, I've seen this Rashi many, many times, but it never hit me what Rashi was saying. Right, just reading the Rashi is amazing. Rashi says the purpose of the Golus is to lock this fellow away in the Miklat so they can't draw spiritual energy from the Cohen Gadol because they contradict what the Cohen Gadol is. So it's such an amazing concept, remarkable. Okay.
You would think he would actually need more spiritual.
He would need more spiritual influence than the Cohen Gadol, but he's cut himself off from it. His act.
His replicators with him.
Yes, but his act of spiritual failure is so bad that he simply can't be there in the presence of the Cohen Gadol. He's like a living contradiction of the Cohen Gadol.
Yeah, it's sort of saying he's not allowed to get that spirituality. He's not going to be potentially able to do to Shubha, therefore, but he will be coming out potentially from this Miklat and joining the rest of society at some stage when the Cohen Gadol dies.
Yes.
And that's where I'm struggling a bit with that one, because it would be one thing if he was staying there and was going to be forever cut off from the rest of society, but he's not. He may well go out, and he's now going out potentially at an even lower place, having been deprived of spirituality.
So we'll see later, maybe an idea that will help a little bit with this, in which it may be the point is he clearly can't connect with the spirituality of this Cohen Gadol, but could with another Cohen Gadol spirituality. Maybe that's part of what's going on. The relationship was broken down with that particular spiritual mentor. We'll see an idea linked to this. Okay. The next source I want to look at is a Rashbam. And again, I think the Rashbam is a fascinating idea. This is at the bottom of page 3. Ad Mos HaKohen Gadol, till the death of the Cohen Gadol. Lefi Peshuto, the simplest explanation is Kol Yomei HaShofet HaGadol. Throughout the days of the Chief Justice, and then he quotes a pasuk in Yeshaya, which we won't go into for now. So the Rashbam says that the Cohen Gadol is the Chief Justice. Where does the Rashbam get this idea from? Because certainly in the pasukim of Torah Shebechsav, and perhaps throughout the era of the first Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim were the heads of the justice system. When you learn in Sefer Devarim, when it talks about going to ask a shaila, a halachic ruling, you go El Cohen HaLevi, to the Cohen the Levi who's there in those days. So the Cohen Gadol is the chief justice. So the Rashbam seems to say that this person gets released from prison with the death of the chief justice. Now, I don't know exactly what to make of that. Does he mean that this is a concept of judicial reign, of mandate? So, to the degree that the Cohen Gadol is alive, under his justice system, this murderer can be exiled. As soon as the Cohen Gadol dies, the justice, their authority to run the justice system ceases, and therefore the person goes free. So this is the idea that Rashbam says, that with the death of the Cohen Gadol, it somehow doesn't make sense for this person to stay anymore in prison. The force that demanded of them to be in prison is the Cohen Gadol as the Chief Justice. Cohen Gadol now resigns through death as Chief Justice. There's now a new Chief Justice in place. This person goes through free, so says the Rashbam, as an understanding of this idea. Again, a very, very remarkable concept. We now have another source which is also difficult. And this is, I don't think a source that I've ever quoted before in this share, comes from the BeShogeg. The BeShogeg was a Baal Tosfos who lived in France. He was a Talmud of Rabbeinu Tam, and his name was Rabbeinu Yosef, Rabbi Yosef ben Yitzchak, and he was nicknamed BeShogeg because Yosef in the Torah was given the description as BeShogeg, and therefore he was nicknamed BeShogeg. You see, in the era of the Baal Tosfos, they used to give biblical nicknames to figures. For example, the famous Rabbeinu Tam, his real name was Yaakov, and he was called Rabbeinu Tam because Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Hadim. So they used to give biblical nicknames, and this Rabbeinu Yosef, who was a generation after Rabbeinu Tam, from the movement of the Baal Tosfos, he was a Tosafist, and he was known as BeShogeg. And he wrote a very beautiful Tosfos type commentary on the Torah, and he says something very, very interesting. Again, difficult to know what to make of it. And the BeShogeg says that you know why he stays alive until the death of the Cohen Gadol? Because we need to pick an individual who represents the passing of a degeneration. I deprived someone of life. I killed someone. Through so doing, I deprived them of their spiritual mission and the job they should have done in their world. I deprived them of seeing out their days. How long is their days? What generation do they belong to? How long is their era of existence that has been stolen from them? And the answer is, with the shifting of a generation and an era in history, their spiritual mission, their life that they should have lived, that particular mission has passed, and therefore the murderer can go free. Now, again, I don't fully understand this, but if we think about in modern examples, we talk about the Victorian age, the Edwardian age. Somehow, the death of a leader is a symbolic paradigm shift in the nature of that generation, and a new era starts. So my guess is that each Cohen Gadol brings, we don't think of it like this, but each Cohen Gadol is our chief emissary to serve Hashem. The concept of a Kohen is that they are a shliach, right? We discussed this in previous years when we looked at the concept of Chana, that we're eating the Shulchan Gavoya, the Kohenim of the shlichim, the agents, the messengers. They're the spiritual channels for the Jewish people. The Cohen Gadol is somehow the formative spiritual influence on the generation, who carves the era within which they are living. And with the death of the Cohen Gadol, a historic spiritual era has come to an end. We estimate this as the end of the life of the victim, and therefore the murderer has, in a sense, finished. They've been imprisoned for the time that the victim had for their spiritual mission, and now it's time for the murderer to go out and start a new life. Thus, says the BeShogeg, arguably. We're running a little short time, so I've slightly misquoted the BeShogeg. Have a look at it in the Hebrew and the English and see what you make of it. But anyway, this is an attempt to understand, perhaps, and give a little bit of meaning to the comments of the BeShogeg. The Cheskuni says a wonderful idea, and again, absolutely fascinating. And he says, and this maybe connects to your point when you were asking about spiritual influences and so on. He says, let's read Cheskuni inside the top of page 4. Shari Ore Miklat Shelavim, the ear Miklat of the Levites. Tachas Yoto Shel Cohen Gadol, they are under the authority, the dominion of the Cohen Gadol. V'zen nichnas Tachas Yoto be'iron. They enter into the Cohen Gadol's domain by living in a city. Mishpatu, and therefore it is justice, Lotzeis Chofshi b'Moso, to go free, to be released upon his death. So the Cheskuni says that somehow the murderer is the guest of the Cohen Gadol. They enter his territory. What are the Ori Miklot? They are the Levite cities. They are the cities granted to the Levium. So everyone in Klal Yisrael has a portion of land. The murderer becomes a temporary Levi. We were talking before when we were hearing about the concept of being Levi. The murderer becomes a temporary Levi. He lives in the Cohen's household. He's made landless. The guest of the Cohen Gadol. He's living under the authority of the Cohen Gadol. Maybe we can add to this that this is meant to be a spiritual experience, in a way completely counter to Rashi's idea. That, you know what happens to this murderer? He moves in with the Kohanim. He moves in with the Levium. He goes and lives in a Levite city and is under the authority of the Cohen Gadol. He becomes a member of the household of the Cohen Gadol. The Cohen Gadol dies. Okay, that's the end of his apprenticeship. Now he goes free and goes out into the rest of the world. What a beautiful idea. This is the spiritual influence of the Cohen Gadol, and he enters into that. The truth is, this is such a beautiful idea, it's hard to know where to go after this, right? So what do we make of Rashi? Rashi sees it as being locked away from the influence of the Cohen Gadol. The Chizkuni says he lives under the Cohen Gadol. He becomes a temporary Levi. He becomes temporarily landless, a guest of the Cohen Gadol, and living in his household, and hopefully being influenced by that experience. The opposite of Rashi. So, all the 42 Ori Miklat plus the 6 dedicated Ori Miklat are all Ori Leviim. The difference is that the 6 Ori Miklat were primarily Ori Miklat and also Ori Leviim, and the other 42 were primarily Ori Leviim, but also used as an Ori Miklat. But all 48 cities of refuge are all Ori Leviim. Yes. No.
That is really bad influence because you're actually it's really hitting in that you murdered more and murder. And whether it's accidentally or not, you are in a place where everyone else also did murder. So isn't this almost like a bad influence to be around everyone else who also murdered, and it's almost like you're desensitizing yourself?
It's a good question, right? This is a general question, the concept of prisons, right? Maybe the worst place to send the prisoners to prison where they network with other criminals. The truth is, how many accidental murderers were there at any one time, and how many people were living in the Ori Miklat? I don't know the answer to this question, but I will reference you to the next source, the Sefanu. And the Sefanu says, you know what the explanation of the death of the Cohen Gadol is? And I do not know what to make of this Sefanu, but I'll tell you what he says. He says it's a way of HaKadosh Baruch Hu controlling how long this murderer should be in prison. When it comes to human justice, we can't read people's minds. We can't gauge to a fine degree culpability. This is an accidental murderer, but there's accidents and accidents, says the Sefanu. How careless were they? To what degree, given their upbringing, their personalities, the degree of responsibility in accidents, how responsible are they? And therefore, how long should they be in prison for? So says the Torah, outsource that problem. That's not a decision that courts can make. A court can't work out how long the prison sentence should be. Your job as a court is to determine this person is a Rotseach BeShogeg, is a culpable but accidental murderer. Send them to prison, send them to the Miklat. How long for? Leave that to B'dei Shemaim. Leave that to Hashem to decide. Hashem will work it out based upon the death of the Cohen Gadol. Now, I don't really know what to make of this. What happens if the murderer is a fairly innocent murderer and therefore ought to be freed after a relatively short time, and as a result, the Cohen Gadol dies? I don't know how that works. What happens if there's 2 people in the Miklat? One is a very terrible accidental murderer, more close to responsible, and the other one was very innocent within it. So I don't know how to crunch the math of what the Sanu says, and it also led me to think, how many accidental murderers were there at any one time for the system to work? But either way, this is what the Sefanu says. This is the job of the court can impose a prison sentence, as it was in Miklat. How long for? Leave that to Hashem. Yeah.
And my problem with this also is, I'm having a problem with this and the Bechor Shor together, where we're saying with the Sefano that Hashem is making those decisions when the accidental killer should be allowed out. And yet I'm thinking this was an accidental killer, and the person he killed didn't actually need to die if Hashem had manipulated things differently. It's something that happened by accident, and it could probably very easily not have happened. So if that's the case, then I'm struggling with the fact that how much free will are we saying that this person had, and how much was he being used as an instrument of Hashem?
Okay, so this is a very fine question, but beyond the scope of the share, and it's a fundamental philosophy. Yeah. For those online, the question being asked is actually to what degree? What about the victim of the murder here? How could they have died early? And to what degree, therefore, were they anyway meant to die then? And whenever a murder is committed, to what degree is the victim anyway destined to die? And there's a Rashi that speaks actually in the context of accidental murder and says it must be that somehow the victim was anyway meant to die at that point. It opens a whole can of theological worms about free will versus predestination. I'll plug my Sunday morning free will versus predestination series. It's on YouTube, and there's all questions you might possibly have about free will and determination. We resolve everything there. No, of course we don't. But we do explore in some depth the little bit of insight that we can give to these terrible and difficult questions around responsibility and human suffering and the like. Okay, the final source I will mention is the Abarbanel, and there's a very similar comment actually from the Rambam in Monavuchim, which I didn't print. And the Abarbanel says, you know why the victim goes free at the death of the Cohen Gadol? Because when something like that happens, when there's national mourning, one's meant to reflect. One's meant to reflect on human vulnerability, on right and wrong, on matters of spirituality, on awareness of mortality. And at a point like that, the Goel HaDam jolly well ought to calm down. So we gave an allowance to a Goel HaDam. We recognize that blood is heated, that the family wants to redeem the blood of their relative who was murdered. And you can stew for a certain amount of time in acts, in the desire for revenge and loathing of the murderer. But then one needs to calm down. One needs to reflect, perhaps the point you made, that everything is in the hands of Hashem, that there's more to life than just Goel HaDam, that we're vulnerable, that we all live, as he says, the days of the men are like shadows. And there's a time to stop dwelling upon the desire for avenging the blood. And this is the death of the Cohen Gadol. It's a time for national mourning and a time for the heart of the Goel HaDam to be calmed. The Rambam Monavuchim, because there's similar angles to this, and he says when people go through tough times, it brings unity. It's a time of national unity. The Cohen Gadol just dies. The nation comes together, right? Maybe the closest parallel we have to this is the recent death of the Queen, right? When a leader dies, it brings the people together. People hopefully do a bit of reflection about what they stand for, says the Rambam Monavuchim, and therefore this is the time for the Goel HaDam to cease sing. This is the final thought of the Abarbanel. Okay, so we've been on a journey today, a bit of a I'm just muting everyone because I'm getting a little bit of interference here. A little bit of a tour through, well-known tour through many of the Mefarshim. What is the concept of the death of the Cohen Gadol? Is it because of culpability of the Cohen Gadol? Is it somehow almost human sacrifice? Somehow the death of the Cohen Gadol is a kapara? Is it that the murderer is cut off from the spiritual influence of the Cohen Gadol Rashi? Or Adarabah, quite the contrary, they're living in the Cohen Gadol's house and through that being influenced? Is it something about the limits of a term of justice? The Chief Justice has died and there's terms of justice, it's the mandate that they have, and the Cohen Gadol can't impose a sentence beyond his own life of imprisonment. Is it the Bechor Shor, that somehow this is the end of an era and a time? The difficult idea of the Sefano, that somehow we're leaving the length of the sentence to Hashem, and finally the concept of the Abarbanel and the Monavuchim, that the death of a great figure is a time of calming down and national reflection, which should relieve the Goel HaDam of his bloodthirsty instincts. Thus ends, at least as far as I can find, the main schools of thought around the concept of Cohen Gadol. So thank you all for joining, as always. Great. Thank you very much. Yes. Right, on a yearly basis. Yeah. I don't know. The Mishnayos talk about the concept of Goel HaDam. It sounds like the concept ran till the close of the Sanhedrin, which took place of some 100 years before the destruction of the Miklat, when the courts stopped imposing capital punishments. I don't know of any historical research or exact clear Masorah as to when the practice of Ori Miklat ceased and how they operated in the Bayis Sheni era. Chazal tell us that the Sanhedrin system continued to operate till the last 100 years of the Bayis Sheni era. After that point, they lost the ability to do capital punishment. So I don't know if the Ori Miklat ran till then or they stopped. But if they were running in the era of the corrupt Kohen Gadol who died on a yearly basis, then Enochanami, it would be a short exile. Yeah.
Do we think that they will restart again on Mashiach?
It's a very good question, and that really depends on what Mashiach is and to what degree there will still be accidental murders. This is the God there are sources around that, but again, I'll do something for another year. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all those online for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.